Good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to give you the big picture for business in Africa. I'm Arnold. Segawa. On the agenda today, a few days away as Zimbabweans will be going to the polls. It will be the country's first election in 38 years that will not feature the founding president, Robert Mugabe, on the ballot paper. Our panel of experts from across Africa will discuss the significance of the 30th of July poll. Crossing over just a few yards away, the 10th BRICS Summit is kicking off today in South Africa. Leaders from Brazil, Russia, India, China, and of course South Africa have gathered in Johannesburg. We'll be crossing to our team in the next few minutes for a ground interview and also insights from therein. In Youth Africa, our Capital Connection correspondent Nazi Zote speaks with gaming entrepreneurs and founders of Nyamakop Games, Cukia, Kimani and Myres. First, Maggie Motisi in Kigali casts her eyes across the stories making headlines in Africa. So what's happening today on the continent, Maggie?
Now here in East Africa, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Uganda on the second leg of his three-nation tour to Africa, where he'll be addressing the parliament in Kampala today. Now the Premier's visit, which started in Rwanda, has seen India sign several bilateral agreements with the two East African countries. Also, Kenya Airways has signed a memorandum of understanding with Air Madagascar and Air Austria, which will see the three airlines develop a codeshare pact meant to grow their network across Africa. Also in Ethiopia, where the country said that a minority stake in the airlines could be up for grabs, the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines has also added that assets such as airports and a five-star hotel could also be sold off to investors. Now those are some of the stories making headlines here in East Africa.
Now, Maggie, for both colonial reasons and later with globalization, a sizable Indian community has established itself across East Africa. Tell me, what is the significance of the visit of the Indian Prime Minister, of course, Narendra Modi, to the region, while considering China's President Xi Jinping was simultaneously also visiting the same turf?
Thanks for the question, Arnold. Now, this is not a coincidence that India and China are visiting the East African countries at the same period of time. Let's first point out the fact that East Africa holds the AU chairmanship. President Kagame, on the other hand, has been reforming lots of things within the organization. And this has also seen the signing of the Continental Free Trade Agreement just a couple of months ago. Now, you're looking at a hot piece of cake here, which is Africa, with a market of 2 billion people, at a time when the US is slapping tariffs on countries like China. In this case, where do you turn to? Of course, to Africa. And we have seen this in terms of increased trade and investments from both countries into the continent. Now, on just this trip alone, Premier Modi committed a $200 million credit loan to both Rwanda and Uganda. China alone in 2016 announced investments of $16 billion US into Africa. Now, both countries need this market. Whether India can catch up with China in terms of the market share in Africa, that is something to look forward to.
Thank you for that, Maggie. Now moving on, Johannesburg Sandton Convention Center is hosting the 10th BRICS Summit, and CNBC Africa's Chris Bishop is there. Chris, there have been some criticisms around the summit, a little more than just stock shops, if I could say. If that's the case, the member states have a lot to talk about. Western sanctions on one end against Russia, and of course the swath against China from the US. Are these issues dominating the discussion, or are we seeing more nuances and themes emerging?
Well, I think certainly the trade war is something that's very, very high on the agenda here, and it's something that affects South Africa here too. Trade Minister Rob Davis said today he feared that South Africa could become collateral damage in this trade war, in particular in the steel and aluminium industry, and also the well-meaning AGOA project that was launched by the United States to help with trade and growth in South Africa many years ago. They wonder what the future of that is now, with Trump threatening sort of a trade war. It's quite been a hot topic here. It seems that China is trying to rally the BRICS nations against the trade war, but I think that overall, I mean, the talk shop maybe Yes, on the one hand it is, but on the other hand, I think that a lot of trade deals could come out of this. I mean, already we've seen billions of rand being pledged to Eskom in loans. We've seen also there's a lot of interest in investment in other parts of the South African economy. In particular, the agriculture industry. China's interested in that, and also the computing industry, which may surprise a lot of people, but the technology in the SKA telescope that's in South Africa is very much of interest to the Chinese, and they want to collaborate and help develop it. So that's just a couple of areas where South Africa can do business at this conference.
Many thanks for that, Chris. CNBC Africa will, of course, be providing continuing coverage of the BRICS Summit throughout the 3-day event. Now, earlier, our Capital Connection correspondent Nazi Zote sat down with Achike Kimani and Ben Myres to talk about gaming and how it is being pursued across the continent. Remember, this is $1 billion market. Take a look.
Cukia, my first question is to you. So you both come from an educational background, but particularly you, do you think that this has had an influence on your success in your business?
Definitely, definitely. I think coming out of University of Witwatersrand, especially the WITS game design course, really helped us to think about game design in a way that just chilling at home playing video games wouldn't. And I think one of the big things about coming from the same game design course, or even university at large, was having the community to meet different creators. I mean, that's how I met Ben over here, and we managed to start the company together.
Wow. And Ben, for you, there are a lot of games out there currently. So from your perspective, how do you manage to keep yourself unique with other competitors?
I think it's definitely very tough. You know, you have to kind of be aggressively creative to stand out, especially in the genre of game we're making, the platformer. So we tried to make a mechanic that was very original and fresh that a lot of people hadn't seen, and so it's the first game where you can actually deform the platforms themselves in the game. On top of that, we also talk a lot about, you know, where we're from as game developers. We talk a lot about, you know, the challenges we face making games in South Africa and Africa as a whole, and try to evangelize the whole scene out there. And that often gets us a lot of press attention as well, which has helped us, you know, reach the consumers as well. It's just talking about the unique challenges we have making games in South Africa.
Okay, well, great. Both of you can answer this last question. There are young people out there who do share the same passion as you for gaming and games and that kind of a thing. What sort of advice would you give them to make their passion more profitable?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely tricky. I think there's two aspects to it. You kind of have to look at the craft of getting good at making games, and that's just about, you know, starting as soon as you can. Like, it doesn't have to be digital games to start. Like, if you just want to make board games with anything you have around, you know, sticks, stones, little toys, anything, just start figuring out how game design works, and then you can escalate to, you know, programs like Scratch or Game Maker, which don't necessarily allow you programming, and then you can, like, sort of become good at that. Then when you start getting good at making games, you just really want to try to get them out there. There are a lot of, you know, the Google Play Store and itch.io, which allow you to release things for free and just get them out to people to play the game, essentially.
Yeah, I think I'd also add is that do a lot of research. Like, take your time and look into what people are doing in the industry. Reach out to us, you know, no worries, we won't bite. And it's always just about learning, a continual learning experience where you're learning what people are doing. And if you have the opportunity to travel or apply for different scholarships to go to places like GDC, Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, you get to interact with a lot of people who are doing their game making as a business and getting to learn the business aspect of it. That's how you're going to be able to make it profitable.
Many thanks for that, Nazi. After the break, our panel of experts discuss Zimbabwe on all things elections. Right after this. Welcome back to Capital Connection, where our panel of analysts will discuss Zimbabwe's election. Now, the coup last year that toppled President Robert Mugabe changed the political dynamics of the country. To discuss what many people view as a watershed moment, I'm joined in the Johannesburg studio by Program Manager for Foreign Policy at the South African Institute of International Affairs, Aditi Lalbahadur, and in Lagos by African Affairs Analyst Achike Chude. Many thanks for making time to speak to us. Let me just start in the studio, Aditi. Who stands out for you, besides the obvious, Mnangagwa, of course, MDC too, but who actually is out there to change their agenda as it is?
Well, I think it's at this point in time, it's anyone's race. There are, for the first time, actually in very many years, about 27 candidates competing for the presidential elections on Monday. And I think, as always, the main contenders continue to be ZANU-PF and the MDC alliance, and then there's also the MDC-T faction, which has also been having some issues with the MDC-A. So those are the three ones that stand out. There's also Joyce Mujuru, who was also once part of the of ZANU-PF, who is also contesting the elections.
Right, let's move over to Lagos. Achike, let's talk about President Mnangagwa as it is right now. We've seen him not do so well in the past when it comes to polls. We've seen him lose twice when it comes to constituencies. Tell me, do you get a sense that this is about to hurt his credibility for the top position?
No, I do not really think that it is. It is about his person. I think it is more about the ZANU-PF and the institution they have built over the years. Coming against the backdrop of the fall of Robert Mugabe, I mean, this election is obviously a litmus test for Zimbabwean democracy. The reality is that, well, he's made some appreciable moves in the direction of democratizing Zimbabwe. We remember that in the past 16 years, that Robert Mugabe made it practically impossible for international observers to observe Zimbabwe's elections. We know what has gone on in the past: intimidation of voters, repression, and you know, all of those negative things that have characterized the Zimbabwean election for quite some time. And so I think it is more about the institutionalization of ZANU-PF, at least in the psyche of the average Zimbabwean, and that is why some of the polls seem to give a very slight edge, you know, to Mnangagwa. But the reality is that over the years, that pool that ZANU-PF had, at least for most Zimbabweans, they have been losing it for quite some time, following the inability of ZANU-PF to deliver on governance in the country. But still, there are those who are still swayed by sentiments, you know, towards the ZANU-PF. Right. Yeah.
Achike, let me just put a pause on that one. Let me bring it back to the studio. Let's talk about the polls, because in 2016, we were very, well, the polls were pointing in one direction and the US presidency went the other way. Looking at the polls right now, we're seeing President Mnangagwa, if we were to vote right now, according to the Afrobarometer polls, 40% of the vote would go to President Mnangagwa. Nelson Chamisa would have 37%. What's your take on this?
Well, I think what's significant is actually the fact that a few months ago, when they did a similar kind of survey, the gap between Mnangagwa and Chamisa was actually significantly higher. So Chamisa, with very little resources at his disposal, has been able to bridge that gap very significantly. I think what we're likely to see is a very contested and hotly contested election on Monday. The most important thing, however, is the environment within which the voting takes place. We've had, up until now, reports of the complaints around the conduct of the ZEC and the fact that they have been displaying a particular bias towards ZANU-PF. We have had in the past, in previous elections, there have been voter intimidation and violence meted out on voters. To vote a particular kind of way. The incidents and reports of violence in the run-up to these elections have been significantly lower. But there have been other kinds of practices that tend to, that have been sort of marginalized urban voters who tend to vote for MDC and for opposition in favor of more rural voters. So, there have been some dubious practices that have already been documented by the international observers that actually call into question the integrity of the elections even before they've actually happened.
Achike, just to come back in here, mention here by Aditi of international observers. Just the other year, we saw the AU send former President Thabo Mbeki to Kenya to observe the elections as it is. He said it was all ticks and everything, and the judge, the Supreme Court, ruled otherwise. How credible are international observers?
Yes, I think that is really going to be the biggest issue with regards to this election. Because there is usually more than meets the eye, especially when it comes to some of the elections that we've been having in Africa. But it is very important to understand the fact that nothing much has changed in Zimbabwean politics. The people who were in charge when we were having all kinds of, manipulation of the electoral process in Zimbabwe, rigging, intimidation of voters, repression, and all of that are still in charge. The only difference is that the man who was in the eye of the storm for so long, that is Robert Mugabe himself, is no longer, the center of attraction. But the reality is that you still have institutions of state that were involved in this this rigging, and we have not had any serious structural change within the Zimbabwean political system or electoral system. So you have the same kind of people, the same kind of environment. The only thing that has changed are the political actors, and these are actors too that have also benefited from the malfeasance, electoral malfeasance of the past. So I think that the international observers have a lot to do in terms of how they're going to observe the elections. But most importantly, the electoral body also has to walk the talk. They have made statements about the fact that they want to hold a credible election. But it is something that we need to see them doing. But if you look at, like I was saying, a lot of the people, the actors who had played significant roles in the past, even while the system was being manipulated in favor of Robert Mugabe, are still there. So those structures are there, and but that is not to say that perhaps we might not have anything, something new. Only that I also am quite skeptical about how it is going to be conducted ultimately at the end of the day. But you never know. We could have at least, the main thing is that Mnangagwa has been walking the talk. He has gone out of his way to invite international observers. The military is playing a more positive role too with regards to this particular election.
Aditi, I see you nodding extravagantly, should I say. Just tell me about that view per se.
Well, I think I'd want to at first maybe disagree with the fact that Mnangagwa has been walking the talk. I think that actually there has been, in the face of a number of reports and a number of complaints from the opposition around the sort of the lack of impartiality of the ZEC, ZANU-PF hasn't actually come to the party to defend the integrity and the independence of elections. But that aside, I think I do want to agree with the other speaker around the role of international observers and the importance that they place, because I think that the history of Zimbabwean politics has abrogated trust in the international community and in international business, and so to be able to get that sanction or that sort of rubber stamp to say yes, these elections were free and fair is an important gateway into re-engaging Zimbabwe with the international community.
Right, let's just unpack something here that's very fascinating. Just leading up to the elections, we see the ZEC change the ballot paper and have a President Mnangagwa on the top right corner, and this is not an alphabetical order. What does it say about the ZEC?
Well, I mean, this is just one part of very many allegations that have been leveled at the ZEC for not being impartial. I think, and actually, this is an issue that the MDC have been trying to gain public protest around, and have been unsuccessful. In fact, yesterday they were told
the demonstrations,
they demonstrated would be illegal, and so on. So I think there's a number of sort of instances where the ZEC have, it's in the way in which it's handled the voter registration process. As I mentioned earlier, the fact that they've been skewing access to be able to register to vote between the urban and rural divide. The fact that the voters' roll itself, even though it's now publicly available, is actually not the same voters' roll that will be used on election day. It hasn't been audited. There's a number of issues. It's also the fact that they're making use of the military to deploy or to sort of distribute these ballot papers throughout the country. It's, even though it's within their mandate to do so, they're doing this with a complete absence of acknowledgement of the role that the military has played in the past in intimidating voters. There's no regard for the psychological impact that would have on voters going to the polling station on Monday.
Right. Let me just swing back to Lagos. Achike, arguably the biggest general of all, from the 80s, former President Babangida had a way with the military. And what we saw earlier on this month, an acknowledgement from ZANU-PF, some of the members, that if at all the ZANU-PF did lose, the military was not ready to come to the table with an opposition party. As someone who's lived in a country where you've seen the military have a very heavy hand, tell me what this actually signifies. What does this underpin?
Yeah, I mean, what is clear, and it's not just in Zimbabwe, but in virtually all the countries in Africa that have not been able to take their democracy maybe to an acceptable level. You find out that in most of these countries that the military has usually a larger-than-life image. And so, of course, we know that for so many years after independence, we are having all kinds of military regimes, dominating the scene. They caused a lot of confusion, and they entrenched themselves deeply. Even when they left power, you still found out that some of the retired generals were still very, very influential. Some of them went into politics, and then ascended the hierarchy of political power in many countries, in Africa. And so they are still very, very influential, exercising a lot of control on the military. And that's why it was not really surprising that Robert Mugabe had the kind of partnership or collaboration that he had with the military. They need the military institution. The military institution is actually, the power behind most of the governments in Africa, and not the people. Until you are such a time that you can advance democracy to a level where the people actually, are empowered enough to realize that democracy is about them and not about this military institution is just there to serve the needs of the state. And so the military is still very key in virtually all the countries in Africa. And that's why a lot of political leaders in Africa tend to give them, accommodate them unnecessarily because of the fear of a possible, intervention in the politics of these countries. And we see that seriously in Zimbabwe. So it is the military institutions that sustain some of these, in quote, democratic governments, and not the will of the people. And for as long as you continue to do that, you're going to have the political class defer a lot to the military, even when it is not in the interest of the nation to do so. And that is what has played out in Zimbabwe for so long, and it is still very much, there within the political system in Zimbabwe. You cannot discount the influence of the military. Right. They have warned in the past, really, that any election that brings a rival political party to power will not be accepted by the military. So that gives you an idea of the overwhelming and negative influence of the military institution in political power in Africa.
Right. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we did have. Well, many thanks to my guests. And that's where we will be leaving it for this evening. Please join us again on Monday at 6:30 East Central African Time for yet another edition of Capital Connection, where Zimbabwe's pivotal election will feature once again in our discussion. I'm Arnold Segawa. Have a good night.